Well, welcome to the show. Today we are talking about one of the great works of C.S. Lewis, The Abolition of Man. And we have a scholar who has written a new book on the subject, Dr. Michael Ward. Dr. Michael Ward is a senior research fellow at Blackfriars Hall at the University of Oxford. He also teaches an online course at Houston Baptist University, and he's the author of a number of books on C.S. Lewis, including the award-winning Planet Narnia, The Seven Heavens, and the Imagination of C.S. Lewis. He's also featured as a priest in a brand new movie about C.S. Lewis called The Most Reluctant Convert with Max McLean. Dr. Ward, great to have you on the show.
Thank you, Dave. Glad to be with you.
Well, maybe before we get into your book, you could tell us a little bit about this movie. I thought you did an excellent job, but you are a priest, so this came very naturally to you acting the part. Tell us a little bit about how that came about being featured in this movie, The Most Reluctant Convert, on the life of C.S. Lewis.
It came about because the director of the movie, Norman Stone, has had a long-standing interest in C.S. Lewis. He really made his name with the first version of the film Shadowlands. He made that originally for the BBC, long before it was a feature film with Anthony Hopkins.
Wow.
And Norman Stone won lots of awards for that. And because of his interest in C.S. Lewis, I approached him after my book Planet Narnia came out. You mentioned Planet Narnia.
Yeah.
And I asked him if he might be interested in making a documentary about Planet Narnia, and he said yes. And that happened, and that was broadcast on the BBC back in 2009, I think it was. So I've had this connection with Norman Stone, and when he came to make this new movie, The Most Reluctant Convert, about Lewis's conversion, he saw that there was this small part for an Anglican priest, and he thought I would be up to doing it. I've done a bit of acting.
Yes, weren't you in a James Bond film as well as an extra?
Yeah, I was in a James Bond movie. I handed Pierce Brosnan a pair of X-ray spectacles in the film The World Is Not Enough. So I'm fairly familiar actually with film sets, but I've never been an actor before. I've always been only an extra. So it was a great delight actually to have some lines and a credit, and also to feature in a scene that was really the climax of the movie. After Lewis has returned to his Christian faith, that he was brought up as a Christian, of course, and then fell away for a couple of decades. But when he comes back, he goes to church on Christmas Day and receives Holy Communion for the first time in ages. And it's my job to give him Holy Communion, and that's really where the movie ends. It was a real privilege. It was great fun 2 days being in that movie. It was really good. And if your viewers haven't yet seen The Most Reluctant Convert, they really should, because it's really worth watching.
Yes, it's an excellent movie. We had Max McLean on last week, and it is an excellent movie. So highly recommend it. You know, this last year, it's just kind of stirred in me appreciation and love for C.S. Lewis. I've been drawn to Christian apologetics, but truthfully, I always respected Lewis, but it was not like I absolutely loved him. I at times felt like, in seminary, I was drawn to Thomas Aquinas, who's very direct, and in Protestant circles, everybody talks about C.S. Lewis, and sometimes I felt like some of my Protestant friends misrepresented him, but lately there's just been a love that I've had, and I've gone back to read him. So several things is I watched the movie a few months ago, loved it. I got married 6 months ago, and I've been reading my stepdaughter and my wife the Narnia books, and I've read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, but we're almost done with the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. We read Prince Caspian, so there's this new love. And honestly, with the works of Surprised by Joy and The Abolition of Man, I struggle with both because Lewis's philosophical nature, and he's just so well read. He quotes all these sources that are a little bit hard that I'm not familiar with, even though I have a master's degree in philosophy. But you do a great job in this commentary to help us to understand what Lewis is talking about. You help define some of these words, and you've published them together. Now, I bought the Kindle book off Amazon, but I just saw after I purchased it that there's a better place to buy it through your publisher. Tell us a little bit about Word on Fire Publishing and how our audience can purchase this commentary that you have written on the Abolition of Man?
Yeah, Word on Fire academic line is a new imprint. My title is only the second of the titles they've published in that imprint. The first book was a very good book on Tolkien, and then mine on C.S. Lewis. And they managed to strike a deal with HarperCollins, the publishers of C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man, and managed to persuade them to issue it in a new edition, so that the two books, my guide and the Abolition of Man itself, have matching covers.
Oh, that is great.
Yeah,
So the best place is to go right to Word on Fire Publishing and buy it through the new academic line there. And
exactly. wordonfire.org/humanity. That will take you to the website of the publishers, and that way you get a free copy of the Abolition of Man just thrown in. Whereas if you buy it through Amazon or some other publisher, you only get my book, I think.
Well, let's jump right into it. I highly recommend this to buy the commentary as well. Tell us a little bit about this. Lewis is, he gave this series of lectures, and he published this, I think, 1943, around the time of World War II. And tell us a little bit about what was going on in the world, and also what was going on in academia that inspired Lewis to give this set of lectures.
Yes, I tried to give some background and sort of historical context to this argument. Lewis is really just tackling the growing prevalence of a philosophical view called subjectivism or emotivism or relativism, any version of that which basically undermines the belief in objective value. That's what he's attacking. And so the book is really both an attack upon subjectivism and a prediction of where we might end up if we go down the subjectivist path, if we give up on the idea that values are objective, if we just think we project value onto what we see from our own personal preference, our own private whims, our own appetites, our own personal interests. If we go down that path, we'll be effectively eradicating an essential part of our own humanity. And so the third part of the Abolition of Man is a forecast of a destination which is going to be very unlovely, very unattractive, and that's why he calls the book The Abolition of Man. He's predicting that we're going to end up either devolving into mere animality, becoming no different from the beasts, or we'll evaporate up into a kind of false spirituality, forgetting that we are embodied creatures, that we actually exist in the flesh. And both options are going to be pretty disastrous for us, because we are created to be rational animals. We combine the sensitive soul with the intellectual soul. We are that unique thing in the whole of creation, which is an embodied spirit.
Dr. Ward, this is during the time of Hitler, and Lewis comes out and he takes to task this school book, which he calls the Green Book. And maybe I'll just read a part of this. I shall refer to these gentlemen as Gaius and Titius. He doesn't give their real names. Of course, in your commentary, you've done the research to go into who this book, who the authors were. But it's a textbook, the Green Book. But I promise you, there is such a book, and I have it on my shelves. In their second chapter, Gaius and Titius quote the well-known story of Coleridge in The Waterfall. You remember that there are two tourists present. The one called it sublime and the other pretty, and that Coleridge mentally endorsed the first judgment and reject the second with disgust. Gaius and Titius comment as follows. When the man said this is sublime, he appeared to be making a remark about the waterfall. Actually, he was not making a remark about the waterfall, but a remark about his own feelings. What he was saying was, I have feelings associated in my mind with the word sublime, or shortly, I have sublime feelings. Now, Lewis believes that this is a serious problem. Why does he believe that this is a problem to be teaching subjectivism?
Well, in short, because it's untrue, but also it's particularly deleterious to be teaching it to children when you're supposed to be teaching them, as the authors of the Green Book are supposedly teaching them, about English composition. That's what their book is supposed to be about, and yet it smuggles in this false philosophy, and, as it were, conditions children to assume a kind of subjectivist worldview, to assume that your attitude and mine about a waterfall, or indeed about anything whatsoever, is basically pure subjectivism. And also, this is an important point, also that our feelings are completely irrelevant to a knowledge of the world. Whereas, in fact, what Lewis is trying to argue is that, no, there is a real world out there, and we can know it. We can't know it exhaustively. We can't know everything about it. And our subjective viewpoint matters. Our particular perspective is important. We are created as individuals, after all. And so our particular way of seeing the world is unique to us. But that doesn't mean we can't talk intelligently and meaningfully with other people about the world that we share and the waterfalls that we together observe. Now, we can, of course, debate about whether a waterfall is better described as sublime or pretty. And, there are waterfalls which are particularly majestic, like the Niagara Falls. And there are little just, drips and puddles that you would not want to call sublime. And so there's obviously a sliding scale of sublimity that we can discuss and argue about. But there's only any point in arguing about the correct application of an adjective like sublime if there's a real waterfall with real qualities inherent in it. And if you embrace subjectivism fully and logically and completely, you end up annihilating human discourse altogether. There's no point in talking if we can't talk about a real thing outside both your perspective and mine.
Lewis seems to be concerned. It's an interesting point. When I was first reading this, I thought, well, he's against feelings, but no, that's not the case. Lewis is absolutely for feelings, and this is part of, perhaps, would you say, his draw to not just philosophy, but also to literature as well, that there's something of the soul of these virtues that come out. And what he has found, I believe he said as a reference, that he noticed that there is this, his concern about many students is that their feelings are not appropriately to the right thing, right? So he's not against feelings at all. Why was this important during this time? How does this play into part with the society during the World War II? What is there a connection that Lewis is making between these two about having appropriate feelings towards the things that are good and just and beautiful?
Yeah, one of the connections to his particular time and historical context is war propaganda. That propagandists play upon our emotions. They try to exploit our emotions, particularly fear of strangers and suspicion of outsiders. Now, a certain amount of fear of alien invasion is appropriate.
Yeah.
A country needs to have secure defenses. A house needs to have well-built walls to keep out the weather and intruders. So a certain amount of fear is a wise and proper way to respond to the threats of reality, but it can be exploited. People can play upon it for malicious ends, and they can work up a sort of nativism and hostility to the outsider, which is completely out of proportion to any real or perceived threat. So Gaius and Titius, the authors of this Green Book, they see young people being swayed by propaganda, and they think the best way to get around this is to say that feelings don't matter at all, that feelings are just a subjective passion that differ from one person to another. We can't trust them in any way. They have no bearing upon reality. But Lewis is trying to say, no. Just because you can abuse something doesn't mean there isn't a proper use for it. Just because feelings can be exploited doesn't mean that they can tell us nothing about the nature of reality. So the important point is to train your emotions, to stabilize your feelings, to bring yourself into a state of having just sentiments, civilized sentiments, so that the head can rule the belly through the chest. That's the great line that in a way sums up the abolition of man, that our rational head governs our passions in our belly, our feelings, our emotions through the chest. And it's this chest, in his philosophical model of the person, which is the liaison officer combining cerebral man with visceral man. And it's this chest which is the definitively human faculty.
Tell us a little bit about this in detail. When he first starts mentioning the chest and the intellect, my mind went back to Plato and the Republic I had read many years ago. But help us understand, maybe unpack that a little bit more about he's talking about, these are different ways of describing the human soul, right? Is that what he's talking about? These are different aspects of the human. Help us to understand a little bit about what he means by chest, and how, and the influences of these ideas that impacted C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, well, it's there's so much to say. It's hard to analyze. It's hard to summarize it.
Right. Like this whole idea, like of the chest and the ruling. Where is this aspect? Is this in the writings of Plato? Is this in the Republic, or where does this? He quotes another source, another author, I think, of the Middle Ages, who believe this as well. Who is that? He cites
Alanus, but he quotes so many people. He's quoting Plato. He's quoting Aristotle. He's quoting St. Augustine of Hippo, about the ordered affections, the ordo amoris, and really there are any number of philosophers and religious traditions that support this basic contention that the head rules the belly through the chest. We are embodied creatures. We are spiritual. We are intellectual, like the angels. We are appetitive. We are passionate, like the animals. And a well-ordered human person is able to draw upon both the high and the low elements in themselves, where appropriate, and put them into dialogue with each other, and integrate oneself as a complete person. And really, that's a view of the human person which is, in essence, accepted implicitly by all, or virtually all, traditions of human wisdom and philosophy and religion. And that's why at the end of the Abolition of Man, Lewis has an appendix citing 8 moral laws, various duties that we have to one another, duties to ancestors and elders, duties to children and posterity, the duty of special beneficence, the duty of general beneficence, the duty of truth-telling and veracity, and various others. And then under each of these headings, Lewis cites examples from Buddhism, Hinduism, ancient Babylonian, Old Norse, Christian, Jewish, humanist, any number of traditions which have seen the importance of these moral values, and in order to obey these moral values, you need to be able to regulate your desires. You need to be a human being, because this is human wisdom. This is what it means to be a member of Homo sapiens. We are sapient creatures.
When I first read Lewis years ago in The Abolition of Man, I was kind of surprised when he first talked about the Tao, coming from an evangelical Protestant American tradition. Surprised. Well, why doesn't he reference natural law? Why does he call the Tao? Is this too wishy-washy? But then he gives his appendix, and he says, later he says what others may call the natural law, and he's very clear that he's not arguing for Christianity in this book like he does in Mere Christianity, but he's finding a common objective moral law that is written on the hearts. Why do you believe that Lewis prefers the word the Tao in this context of this work?
Yeah, the word Tao, T-A-O, is a Chinese term. It's from Confucius, and it means the way that the universe goes on, the way to live an ordered, correct human life. And he deliberately chooses that Chinese term rather than a Western term, let alone a Christian term, to emphasize his fact that objective value, belief in objective value, is a universal human perception and experience. We recognize it all the world over and down through the ages. Now, Lewis was already in 1943 becoming quite well known as a Christian apologist. He'd published The Problem of Pain. He'd published the Screwtape Letters. He'd given some of the early addresses on the BBC that would go to become Mere Christianity. And I think by reaching across to Chinese philosophy for this term Tao, rather than using a more expected term like natural law, he's trying to wrong foot those who would assume lazily, oh, this is just another standard, boring old Christian presentation of objective value. No, he's saying it's bigger than that. This is actually a claim in philosophical anthropology. I'm not just trying to defend Christianity here. I'm trying to defend all coherent, logical, philosophical and religious traditions whatsoever, because that basic foundational recognition of objective value is what constitutes our humanity. And only when you've got that bedrock layer laid down can you then proceed to make arguments for the Christian God, for instance. You can only be a Christian if you're a human being first. And one of the things that defines our humanity is this recognition of objective value. If we give up on that, we abolish ourselves. Hence the title of his book, The Abolition of Man.
You tell us a little bit about some of the parallels between The Abolition of Man and some of the other works of Lewis. Maybe you could reference maybe a few similarities between That Hideous Strength, or perhaps in I think it was Eustace Clarence Scrubb in The Voyage of the Dawn Treader, who turns into a dragon. When there's this denial of natural law, what is the consequences? And maybe you can reference just a few other pictures that we see this taking place in the other works of Lewis.
Yeah, well, the more I looked into The Abolition of Man and saw its connections to Lewis's other writings, the more I began to see how very, very central it is to his whole output as a writer and thinker, which helps explain, by the way, why he should say, as he does, that The Abolition of Man is almost my favorite among my books. That's no small claim. It's almost his favorite among all, and he wrote a lot of books.
Yes.
And then That Hideous Strength, the third book in the Ransom trilogy, was his favorite book in that trilogy too. Because That Hideous Strength is a kind of fictional counterpart to The Abolition of Man. A lot of the ideas which are expressed philosophically and propositionally in The Abolition are dramatized and turned into a novel form in That Hideous Strength. So in That Hideous Strength, the villains of the piece end up worshipping a decapitated head. They're so against the belly and indeed the chest that all they're prepared to acknowledge as meaningful is the head. thinking that thereby they're going to become exclusively rational. They're going to get rid of the body and all its misleading passions. But what ends up happening is that they become devil worshippers. Because, okay, the angels are intellectual, they are spiritual, and in that sense, we share something with the angelic realm as human beings. But if we try to pretend that we are merely angels, nothing but angels, not embodied creatures, we evaporate up into this false spirituality, which might on the surface sound, oh, good, we're becoming like the angels. But remember, the devils, the demons, are angels. They're just they're fallen angels. And it's just as likely we'll end up in that kind of spirituality as in anything good. Indeed, it's inevitable that we will end up like that, because God has made us to be embodied creatures. And if we try to resist our embodied nature, that is a sin, essentially. So that's one work that is worth looking at for people who want a kind of fictional version of these ideas. Another is the Narnia Chronicles. You mentioned Eustace Clarence Scrubb in The Dawn Treader. And that's certainly a good example of someone who devolves into bestiality. He becomes literally a dragon. But two other examples, smaller examples, I think are rather telling. We've been talking about the chest, and it's interesting to me how Lewis smuggles into the Narnia Chronicles some very telling mentions of the chest, so that Peter, King Peter in the first book, The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, he grows up to become a tall, deep-chested warrior.
Yes.
Whereas in the last book, the last battle, the ape Shift, who's this kind of antichrist figure, remarks what weak chests apes always have. So there you've got just a little nod to Lewis's argument in The Abolition of Man.
As I've been reading these simultaneously, I see these little pieces, because this last year I've just really got it, I've really gotten into C.S. Lewis and read, The Abolition of Man, now Screw Tape Letters, leading the men's group through it, and then the Narnia series. And you do see these little phrases that are, that Lewis is very brilliant in putting these little aspects in his other works. It's very purposeful. Maybe we can talk a little bit about this third, just emphasize a little bit about the third part of The Abolition of Man and the result. It seems that his concern is what is being taught. He starts off with the school books, being taught a radical subjectivism, how that's going to just subtly impact the children. They do not know that politics and ethics are at stake. And then there seems to be this drift that this will lead to another objectivism or another type of absolutism that will be taught by the elite. That what is the shift that has taken place, that there will be those who will rise up, who will believe in absolutes? Tell us a little bit about what the abolition of man will result in from a practical, from the standpoint. What is Lewis saying there?
Yeah, the third chapter of The Abolition of Man is, as I say, a kind of forecast or prediction, a prophecy of where radical subjectivism will lead if people genuinely try to buy into it and live consistently in a subjectivist mindset. And actually, it's quite difficult to live consistently as a subjectivist, because as he says elsewhere, really what presents itself as subjectivism is really just fragments of the Tao, torn out of the whole and swollen to madness in isolation from the rest, so that people have their one or two objective values that they think are absolutely non-negotiable, but everything else, of course, is subjective. But this little fragment of the Tao I'll cling on to, be it, I don't know, the idea that sexism is bad or racism is bad. That's true.
Right.
But every other moral value, well, that's just a private preference. Now, Lewis, of course, is not saying that sexism and racism are not bad, but he's saying that they are just parts of this seamless garment of moral value. And so if racism is wrong, then so is conjugal infidelity.
Yes.
you can't cheat on your wife just because you happen to be,
Right.
as pure when it comes to racial questions.
And we're seeing this in our culture too. Lewis writes, a dogmatic belief in objective value is necessary to the very idea of rule that is not tyranny or an obedience to slavery. And so in that hideous strength, Lewis talks about the NICE, or the National Institute of Coordinated Experiments. And there was an article in First Things magazine that concerned that, like in the NIH, Francis Collins, who was a fan of C.S. Lewis, said, we have at the University of Pittsburgh, we've done experiments humanizing rodents with fetal tissue that the NIH spent $115 million in fetal experimentation. And so do you see any of this? Some are concerned that maybe what we're seeing today in the name of science, the push of transgenderism, money being pushed for experiments that, for young children, for example, to be pushed for in the name of science, in the name of research. Do you think that Lewis was being prophetic of any of this that has taken place that we see in our culture?
I do. Yeah, it's very prophetic work. And you don't have to be a Christian to see that. There's in Britain an atheist philosopher, John Gray, who has described the abolition of man as very prescient and as relevant now in the 21st century as when it first came out, if not more relevant. But I think the important point to take away is from your earlier quote about a belief in objective value is necessary to any rule which is not tyranny and to any obedience which is not slavery. And I think that pairing of tyranny and servility is very important, because we mustn't take away from the abolition of man the idea, it's all about our rulers and the powerful who are going to, wreak havoc upon the world. Though, of course, that, that's part of it. But we've also got to remember our own responsibility, that tyranny is only the flip side of civility. A tyrant rules over someone that he shouldn't rule over, just as the servile surrender to people they shouldn't surrender to. So the two errors exacerbate each other, they play off each other. So when it comes to, questions like the ones you are raising, I'm sure Lewis would say, yeah, those are serious matters. But note the example that he actually talks about in the Abolition of Man, because this is an example that Christians don't want to talk about. Pretty much all Christians don't want to talk about contraception.
Right. He talks about the airplane. That's true. That's there in the beginning of chapter 3. And this was before the pill even came out. He mentions the wireless, the airplane, and the contraceptive. And tell us a little bit about that. Especially Protestants. I know you are a Catholic priest, and I remember for me being challenged on this issue years ago when I was in Washington, D.C., just interacting with some of my Catholic friends. What was Lewis's concern at the beginning of the abolition, that third section in the Abolition of Man, about the contraceptive?
Well, it's interesting that in 1930, the Church of England, Lewis's church, he was an Anglican, revised its teaching on contraception. Until 1930, the Church of England was completely opposed to contraception. But then in 1930, it opened the door just a teeny tiny crack and said, well, in certain very limited circumstances, contraception is okay. But only very, very minor concessions were given. Nowadays, of course, what are we, about 90 years later, nobody turns a hair. Nobody gives a second thought to contraception. Of course, contraception is okay. It'd be wrong not to contracept. But I think
you'll be proud of me. I got married 6 months ago. 2 weeks later, my wife's pregnant. We have a baby coming in 3 months. No contraception, so we'll see.
Marvelous. But I think Lewis, having such a clear mind and seeing how chains of logic would connect, he said to himself, okay, right, so contraception is now okay, is it, under certain circumstances? That means that we're sort of beginning to control our bodies in a new way. We're beginning to say, I'll have this bit of my body, but not that. I'll accept every part of you, my beloved wife, but not your fertility, and you won't accept mine. So we're beginning already to manipulate our bodies in ways which ultimately result in things like the contemporary transgender movement. It's all of a piece. It's all of the same. It's all flowing from the same principle, that we can take a kind of controlling, manipulative approach to nature, including our own nature, and we can see ourselves and the world around us as so much raw material to be chopped up to suit our own convenience. And that might look very innocent at the start. And it's very difficult in some respects to argue why contraception is wrong. But all Christian traditions until 1930 regarded it as wrong. And it's really only the Catholics who have held the line on that issue. And even most Catholics, it must be said, don't really practice what the church teaches.
Right. It's interesting that these decisions lead in the effect the next generation. I mean, people will not be born, but then he moves in, I think about a page later, where he talks about eugenics as well. And at what point, and now what we've seen since the time of that, with what I mentioned, experiments, being done at the University of Pittsburgh, funded by NIH, the president who was a Lewis fan, right? And we're spending $115 million on fetal experiments. And so fascinating book. In closing, Dr. Ward, in addition to your book, what are some other places that we can go if someone is wanting just to grow in their knowledge of C.S. Lewis, maybe in order of books? The Abolition of Man is a tough one. I highly recommend that our audience buy both Dr. Ward's commentary called After Humanity and read that simultaneously, and do it in a small group. That's what I'm doing right now with a group of men. Read it together, discuss it, learn from it. But what are some other places for the person who's wanting to grow in C.S. Lewis where they can go?
Yeah, I think a good way actually of limbering up for the Abolition of Man is to read or reread the first few chapters of Mere Christianity, because there Lewis is really advancing the same argument, but in a much more accessible and popular way. Because, of course, Mere Christianity originated as radio broadcasts on the BBC, whereas the Abolition of Man originated as philosophical lectures at a major university. Yes. So you can prepare yourself for the Abolition of Man, which is a difficult book. I find it difficult myself. I'm no philosopher. This is one of the reasons I wrote After Humanity, to help myself understand Lewis's book, let alone anybody else. So reread Mere Christianity. There's also relatively short pieces like The Poison of Subjectivism and his essay on ethics. They are all sort of making the same essential point. Because in The Abolition of Man, he often takes a rather oblique approach to the subject. It's a very rhetorically ornate book, The Abolition of Man. I mean, it's a brilliant book. It's one of his most profound and important books, but it's not easily accessible.
Yes. Well, excellent suggestions, Dr. Ward. Just an honor to have you. You have stirred my love for C.S. Lewis. Now I want to read your other book on Narnia, about Planet Narnia. I'm going to finish those, and I really want to work through most of the works of C.S. Lewis in the next 2 years. And just thank you so much for your inspiration. And again, just great to have you on the show.
My pleasure. Thanks, Dave. God bless you and your wife and the baby.
Oh, thank you so much. God bless.